So we're going to start tonight with reciting the usual prayers that we've been doing on Wednesday evening, which are on page 73. And tonight, let's just do the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha 3 times, and then we'll go forward from there to do the mandala offering and refuge. So this very first verse there, we'll just do that 3 times. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Then page 97 or 98 in the prayer books here, the short mandala offering is going to be on one of those pages. Start on one of those pages, depending on which version of the prayer book you have. We'll just do this verse in English and then skip down a bit to where the Idam Guru, the offering of the mandala in Sanskrit is, and then we'll continue with refuge and bodhicitta, that next prayer. We'll do that once in English and twice in Tibetan. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyan gi pe sonam gi drola penchir sangye drupar shog. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyan gi pe sonam gi drola penchir sangye drupar sho. Okay, let's begin the class time with a short meditation to set our motivation. So just find a good meditation posture and spend the next few minutes meditating on the breath, just working with the breath in whatever way suits your mind. And then after a few minutes, I'll lead you in a short reflection to set motivation for tonight. So I'll ring the chime to begin the meditation. So now let's take a few minutes to refresh our bodhicitta motivation. So this is a motivation that we should ideally be living all of the moments of our life with, trying to use everything that we do as a cause for awakening fully for the welfare of others. But especially as we set about examining this topic once more tonight of minds and mental factors, coming to know our own minds very clearly, coming to understand the way by which we are continuing to be bound in suffering ourselves, and by virtue of that, to be able to understand how all beings are continuing to go from life to life in this unsatisfactory existence, this samsara. And recognizing that these are the tools that we will also need to know to become fully enlightened, to go beyond just liberating ourselves from suffering, to be able to attain the state of Buddhahood, where we can help all sentient beings to be free from their suffering, to achieve their potential. So seeing how important this study is, how necessary it is for us to understand our minds, to understand the minds of all beings, to realize how we are creating our own difficulties, our own problems, our own suffering. Be sure to do this with the motivation of bodhicitta, thinking that everything that we do is being directed towards the enlightenment of all beings. That's the main goal, to bring all sentient beings to that state. But then recognizing that in order for us to accomplish that, we have to become a Buddha ourselves. We have to be fully qualified. So we have those two aims that we're trying to accomplish: the welfare of all sentient beings, which is the main aim, but then our own enlightenment, which is secondary but necessary for us to be able to accomplish our primary aim. And just hold that very deeply in your heart so it becomes the fundamental motivation for everything we do tonight. Okay, so we are working with the mental factors. We just started the more formal exploration of these in the fourth class. Oh, I need to turn on the TV. That's a good idea. Before I get to the slides, it's going to be a few minutes before I do the slides probably, because we're going to continue looking at feeling, which was the first of the 5 omnipresent mental factors. So recall again that we're looking at this presentation of these mental factors being ways that we can isolate various functions within our minds, various parts of our mind, aspects of our mind. Minds is the whole, kind of the what's the word for it? Kind of they use again, Geshe Tashi used the idea of like a movie screen, kind of the canvas upon which everything else is painted or is reflected. So the mental factors give all of the shape to it and kind of define our experiences, but it's within the context of mind that everything is experienced. And so what we're trying to understand by going through all of these, again, is all the functionality of the mind, Buddhist psychology, in a sense, what's all going on. So the mental factors are divided into 6 main groups. The very first one that we're exploring now is the omnipresent. By omnipresent, we mean that any of our conscious moments, they are definitely present, without a doubt. And so they're playing a fundamental role in terms of our experience all the time. And the first one that we were looking at, feeling, again, feeling started on page 15 of our text, the text by Yeshe Geltzen. And we've gone through most of this. Feeling isn't the whole range of emotional feelings and what have you. It's simply a sort of feeling tone or a registration of a sensation that can be one of 3 things. It can be something pleasant, something unpleasant, or something neutral. And so we are experiencing that all the time. There's some sort of registration. If it was all being plotted on a graph, we'd have times when we're up in the pleasant domain and then we fall down maybe to something that's neutral and then we fall down to something that's unpleasant and so on. And our days are like that. And we're constantly, of course, being triggered by these feelings, by these sensations, to have a whole variety of reactions to them. And most of our reactions are not so in line with reality, and we end up distorting things. We get very attached to the pleasant experiences and very averse to those that are unpleasant and so on. So where we were in terms of looking at all these various divisions of feeling, and there are numerous ones, as you can see, that we've gone through over these pages, is we were just finishing up this section that started at the bottom of page 18, where it said, moreover, when feelings are divided by way of object of abandonment and antidote, there are two: the feelings that support adherence and the feelings that support deliverance. So some of this terminology we frequently see around like our overall objects of abandonment, what we're trying to do on our path. But this specific presentation is really about looking at the whole attachment that we have in general to the desire realm. And the desire realm is all we've known in this lifetime, unless you've developed a mind of calm abiding or higher, these deeper concentrations. Everything that we've had has been within the realm of what we call the desire realm, meaning that we are reacting strongly to objects of desire, which are primarily the sense objects, but we can also have objects of our mental consciousness, of our conceptual mind that we can be triggered by, and so on. So this presentation, I went through a little bit of it last time. If you go to the top of page 19, these are described a little bit. The feelings that support adherence, meaning adherence to the objects of the desire realm, to having that attachment to things in the desire realm, are feelings that are concomitant with the craving for the attributes of the desire realm. So this is, again, something that we have to transcend to develop any kind of realizations. And by transcending it, I don't mean that we are going to completely, annihilate it from the beginning. This is the goal, is to be rid of all of our attachment to the desire realm, all of our afflictions, and so on. That's obviously, what we're aiming for in terms of liberation and even in terms of enlightenment. But what you do in terms of, I explained a little bit of this last week, and I don't want to go into extreme detail, and I did bring in a book that I do recommend if you have any interest in pursuing some understanding of the concentrations and absorptions that I talked about, a book called Meditative States in Tibetan Buddhism by Lati Rinpoche and Denma Lhocho Rinpoche. And it's their commentary on two different texts that go into this and explain in detail how you go about accomplishing this. But essentially what we do is just attaining the mind of calm abiding, which most of you know. Calm abiding is set out in the Lam Rim text, the Stages of the Path text. Lama Tsongkhapa himself goes into great explanation of how to achieve calm abiding. And calm abiding, when you attain that state, you go through 9 mental abidings and you attain the state of calm abiding, you are already to some degree separated from the attachment to the desire realm, though you haven't done the formal process of going beyond that. You already have what would be considered to be a form realm mind. So there are 3 main realms: the desire realm, the form realm, and the formless realm. Once you generate a mind of calm abiding, you're technically dealing with a form realm mind. Form realm minds are products of meditation, as are formless minds, formless realm minds. And what you do from attaining calm abiding is you go, I mentioned a little bit of this last week, you essentially start looking at the mind of the desire realm and the attachment to the desire realm as being very coarse and undesirable. And you see the pleasantness, the peacefulness of attaining the very first of the 4 levels of the form realm, which will be the mind of the first concentration. The 4 levels of the form realm are first concentration, second, third, and fourth. And you can go on to develop each of these, and in each of them, you look at the one that's just beneath it as being gross and coarse, and the one that you're moving towards as being peaceful. So you do a level of analytical meditation involved in this. So it's both your calm abiding, your ability to stay focused, but also what we would call vipassana, or special insight, where you are analyzing. And this is one way of moving through these. This is the main way that's taught, is that you move through these using this kind of mundane path, where you're always looking at what you're leaving behind as having an undesirable quality and moving towards something that is more peaceful, more pleasing, because the mind will be a bit more subdued. But of course, as you move through this, the level that you're at becomes the object of abandonment to move to the next level. So it's kind of interesting. The initial way that it's set out is that you want to be abandoning the attachment to the desire realm to move to the first concentration. But then to move to the second concentration, you have to abandon your attachment to the first concentration. And then to get to the third concentration, you have to abandon your attachment to the second concentration. So it's kind of interesting. One teacher, Geshe Tenzin Temple, who taught over at the master's program in Italy, he was exploring this whole idea, well, are they really antidotes to these objects of abandonment? Because in essence, everything becomes an object of abandonment as you go up, even all the way to the highest realm. There are 4 formless absorptions, and when you get to the highest of those, that still is even an object of abandonment, by your supramundane path, by a path realizing emptiness and selflessness. But nonetheless, it is an abandonment of all the lower layers beneath it, not a final abandonment, because in essence, what you've essentially done is just suppressed your attachment to those different realms as you go through this whole process. But what's being highlighted here is the idea that we begin that whole process of not having so much adherence and attachment to the desire realm by generating that first level of concentration, by moving in the direction of eventual abandonment of all of these. And what they say is that, of course, you will have suppressed those states of mind so that you have much more powerful states of mind to utilize in your realizations. Now, when you get to the subtler minds of the formless absorptions, those they say are not quite as good a platform for doing this type of investigation into emptiness, for example, and so on. But the four concentrations are actually quite powerful minds, the fourth one being the ideal mind, to be able to do that. So if we look at the first one, again, was all about having this attachment to the attributes of the desire realm. The second one is described on page 19 as feelings that support deliverance are, for example, feelings that are concomitant with the mental consciousness that, having turned away from the attachment to the attributes of the desire realm, is included within the actual first concentration. So this is an example. It says are for example, and Geshe Tenzin Temple, when he talks about it, he makes that equivalent to it, but nonetheless, he goes on to talk about the additional concentrations and how they also have a similar characteristic of having transcended beyond the attachment to the desire realm. But your very first step is to go beyond that to the first concentration, and you have to do them sequentially. And then after achieving that, you can go on to develop the second concentration, the third, the fourth, and then again to the four formless absorptions. And so, as I mentioned last week, bodhisattvas do this so that they can generate great dexterity, kind of going back and forth between all of these states, kind of running through them sequentially and then back down through them and what have you, to make their minds very powerful in terms of the meditative component. Were you going to say something, Bob? Yeah. Uh-huh. In this context, I think it just means, Bob's question is, does this term deliverance, when it says supporting deliverance, does that mean deliverance from samsara? Well, in the end, it will support your eventual deliverance from samsara, but in the moment, it's really just deliverance from the attachment to the desire realm. And so in this context, yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Right, 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 right. So Bob's point was just, again, for those who are online, to that those who have achieved the highest state, which again we frequently call the peak of cyclic existence, um, even if they achieve that state, they haven't really achieved any real deliverance, because all they've done through this process is suppressing these levels of attachment to these various realms and haven't really attained liberation. And so again, we can say that these are aids in supporting, deliverance in an eventual way, by virtue of, once you have those concentrations, you can use them as a tool in a supramundane path. But most people develop them in a mundane way, and if you don't use them for any realizations in a supramundane way, going beyond samsara, beyond our worldly existence, then you've kind of wasted them in a sense. Actually, many teachers I've had have said, we've all had these concentrations and absorptions countless times, and we just never did anything with them. We got to these very fine levels of mind, and then all we've done is created what's called the unmoving karma that causes you to be reborn in those realms. In the four form realms, they each have their specific realm that are subtler states of existence than what we have in this coarse desire realm. But nonetheless, our rebirth's just like this, and you are reborn there, and you wear out that karma eventually, and you fall from that state. If you're reborn in a formless state, then you don't have a coarse form at all. You're kind of just hanging out with a very subtle mind with subtle wind and in some domain. But then eventually you fall into and be embodied again, into a lower existence, because you haven't attained anything that's lasting. All you've done is create some energy behind suppressing all of that so you can manifest in those realms, but then that eventually goes away. So again, in this context, it's a little strange, because it's talking about the feelings that support these. And as I mentioned last week, even when you get into some of these different realms, different feelings are not even possible to have because of the subtlety of these various realms. So you don't have any longer any sort of like mental suffering, mental unhappiness in any of these realms because you've abandoned the causes of that to in terms of them suppress or manifesting. You haven't gotten rid of them completely, but nonetheless, you don't really have those feelings. So the one teacher that maybe I'll even read a little bit from Geshe Tenzin Temple on this because I liked what he said. He said, well, this exploration is being set out. I think it was him. Maybe it could be Venerable George. Let me find that real quick. Um, Maybe it was Venerable George. Let me go back to that. Venerable George Chernoff. His commentary on this is really quite helpful too, in terms of the things that he brings into the discussion. He was, let me see if I can find this. He was talking about, I'll just paraphrase what he's saying because I'm not finding it right away, but the idea is that this presentation is to really highlight how so much of the feelings that we have in the desire realm are a good part of our problem, because we are so reactant to all the stuff that's in the desire realm because we have a mind that gets easily attached to all the pleasures and easily angered and frustrated by all the unpleasant things, that this is such a source of all of our problems, that we are adhering to all of that and exacerbating our own suffering. And just by attaining some of the feelings that go along with this first concentration and above and so on, we already are relieving our suffering to a great degree because we don't get so caught up in all of it. I mean, I can only imagine because I've never attained any of these things, but I can't, I can imagine that what they must be able to do when they've come out of achieving the first concentration, for example, is that they come back into their off the cushion into the desire realm and they just don't have anything triggering that level of attachment because it's almost they've seen it in a very distasteful way. It's a coarse way of looking at pleasure because what they attain on the cushion in terms of generating a first concentration mind is so much more pleasant, so much more enjoyable in a sense. So all the pleasant pullings that we have, the things that take us in different directions in our desire realm existence, are no longer enticing in any way. So you've kind of really shut that off for the moment. It's not going to be manifest. But as I said, you haven't really done the deeper work to get rid of it until you've realized emptiness or selflessness. Yeah, Nan. Well, I don't think it's repulsed. It's just you're not enticed. I don't know. I mean, again, because you see them as coarse meaning that there's better ways to obtain your pleasure in a sense, or to find some peace. And so, as I said, you go through that process with each of these, and then you start looking at the first concentration as being coarse, and the second concentration as being more peaceful, and you keep doing that. You get to the top, of course, and there's nowhere else to go because you're at the top, and that's why you have to go to a supramundane path at that point to get rid of the subtle attachment that you might have to that level. But I don't know. I mean, yeah, I don't know that it's repulsed. In answer to your question, our question was, are they repulsed by that, or is it just that there's something neutral about them? But I would say that they're no longer having any draw for you, I would think. So you're not getting caught up in the same patterns. You won't exacerbate your suffering in the desire realm by following after all those objects. Yeah, it won't be something that draws you in. So I don't know if it's really repulsed as much as they've lost their power in a sense. Because where their power is coming from, again, is our minds. As we know, and we haven't gotten to the six root afflictions, but attachment is a mind that is overlaying all of this pleasantness beyond what is there, exaggerating all of that with regard to the object. And so it's making it bigger than it is. And in that way, it is getting sucked up into this pattern of needing that and grasping at that, not wanting to be parted from it, and so on. So if all of that is shut off, if we're just sort of experiencing things, but none of that mental process is going on, then there's just no draw, again, as I was saying. You still would nourish the body or whatever you need to do, but you wouldn't have any of that kind of attachment arising. So anyway, this is concluded with a little bit on that page 19, where it says, such a twofold division of feelings is taught in order to make known the manner in which craving is induced through the force of feeling. This is a bit of what one of the commentators was talking about, where I was mentioning this earlier about why we can find some benefit in looking at feelings in this way, the feelings that support our adherence versus those that support deliverance. So the manner in which craving is induced through the force of feeling. So that is really what we are getting attached to, in a sense. When we have those pleasant sensations, that's what we want to keep recreating. That's what we want to make stronger. That's what we want to not be parted from, and so on. And then also the manner in which one can become free of attachment to feeling, independence on an actual concentration. Again, I think I've mentioned this before, but Venerable Rene Fussi, who's a Swiss-French monk who has done a lot of meditation retreat, I think Venerable Urbina even mentioned this, that he said something like the fourth or fifth level of these mental abidings, you're already experiencing something that is so far beyond any pleasant feeling you've had in your life, that has transcended that in terms of a blissful experience that is not conditioned in quite the same way. It's not our normal patterns of attachment and going after, pleasing things and so on. So let me just conclude this, and then we'll see if there's any questions on feeling before we go on to discrimination, the second of the omnipresent factors. It says, therefore, if you wish to understand these modes precisely, you should carefully consult the upper and lower knowledges, the two texts that I've mentioned previously that are the root of all of this study of minds and mental factors, the Abhidharma Kosha, the Treasury of Knowledge by Vasubandhu, and the Abhidharma Samuccaya, the Asanga's text, the Compendium of Knowledge. Also, one should learn from the stages of the path to enlightenment, of course, the Lam Rim text, especially Lama Tsongkhapa's Lam Rim Chenmo, how not to let the three, pleasant, suffering, and neutral feelings, become causes of the three poisons. And I've talked about this previously. I don't need to maybe say too much, but once more, we always have attachment to the pleasant feelings in general. This is our response, is to, grab at that and exaggerate the pleasant qualities and want to keep that experience going. We have the aversion, anger, hatred, annoyance, irritation, that whole range of things towards what is unpleasant, exaggerating what is unpleasant and wanting to push that out of our sphere of experience. And then we have the sort of dulling out to the ignorance that is exacerbated whenever we are encountering the neutral. We just kind of hang out in that space of not really advancing things. So any questions from either the online folks, or it's really useful if people do use the chat thing. That way I can see the question. I can read it to everyone here as well. But any questions from the room here as well on feeling? So I'm not seeing anything else come up on there. So let's go ahead and go to discrimination. And if there's questions that come up on feeling later, you can you can let me know. So let's see. I want to now share the screen because I'm going to go ahead and put some slides up on. I think that this is how I did it last time. Let's see if that works. I want to do a slideshow from the current slide. I think that's up for everybody. I'm going to actually go forward a number of slides here. I shouldn't have gone quite to current slide. Let me go down here. That's not doing it. Let me go back. I thought I had this set up. Where is that at? Feeling. Okay. Let's try it again from current slide. Okay, so we're in session 5. Hopefully everyone at home can see that. As I mentioned previously, this is the same slide from last week. We have the 5 that are omnipresent because they accompany or arise with all main minds: feeling, discrimination, intention, contact, and attention. Feeling and discrimination, just to remind everyone, I talked a little bit last time about also why they're two of the five aggregates, why they're two of the main ones that the Buddha singled out as part of the basis for a person. And so discrimination is talked about rather extensively as well because of that. So let's go ahead and take a look at discrimination. Actually, before we go look at the screen, let's go ahead and just do the very beginning of that on page 19. It says here, regarding the entity of discrimination, the Compendium of Knowledge, this is a Sangha's text, says, question, what is the defining characteristic of discrimination? This is dushe in Tibetan, which literally means aggregation knowing. It's kind of an interesting derivation for that. The response is, it has the characteristic of knowing upon aggregation. It has the entity of apprehending the sign and apprehending the mark, through which one designates an expression to objects of perceptions, hearing, differentiation, and knowledge. So I'm not going to explain all that terminology because it's going to be explained in the passages following. But in essence, what we say is that this is something that helps us to know on the basis of things aggregating or coming together that this is this and that is that, to be able to discriminate or discern things. Actually, one translation in Geshe Rabtin's text, he calls this discernment. Another translation calls it recognition. All of these have, and this is what's interesting, is the Tibetan words always have kind of a lot of different aspects to them, and you can choose different English words that get at different parts of it, but often we don't have an English word that encapsulates everything that's in there. But discrimination is the more common term that's used. So just a little bit more of that, and then I'll go to the screen, to the slides. Just as it has been said above, it is a knower that upon the aggregation of the three, we often talk about this aggregation. We're going to get into that a bit more when we talk about the mental factor of contact. The object, the sense power, and the primary consciousness. You guys have heard this all before, again, that we need three components to come together for there to be an awareness of an object. The object itself, the consciousness that needs to be there, of course, and then what's called the sense power. The five sense powers are the physical components that are within our eyes, ears, and so on. And then the mental sense power is the previous moment of consciousness that empowers us to know. So in essence, when all those three come together with regard to any particular object and that consciousness that is knowing that object, then we have discrimination that is effective there in order to apprehend, as it says there, the uncommon sign of an object. Uncommon meaning something that will allow us to discriminate what it is, that we can discriminate the color blue from the color yellow and so on, that there is something uncommon to it that doesn't, otherwise we'd have confusion. Everything would just be a full, range of the same thing, and we wouldn't be able to discriminate anything that we are seeing or hearing or knowing in various ways. So let's look at how this is described on the screen by Geshe Rabtin first. He again calls it discernment in that translation. This was actually Stephen Batchelor's term for it. Discernment is a distinct mental factor having the function of identifying the object to be one thing as opposed to another by means of differentiation. So when you first hear this, you might think, well, this sounds like a conceptual process, and there is a conceptual component to it that it feeds into, but it is an omnipresent mental factor, which means that it is going to be present even when a non-conceptual awareness is there. Remember, we've distinguished these two levels of consciousness, two types of consciousness, what we would call our conceptual and our non-conceptual. Non-conceptual being primarily, our sensory experiences, though it also could include some other direct experiences. But conceptuality is definitely involved in a lot of what we're discriminating, because we eventually do start talking about things in terms of terminology, names, concepts, and what have you. So that does play a great role in it, but it's not the totality of what we mean by discrimination or discernment, because it can also be operative with the non-conceptual awareness. So Geshe Rabtin goes on to say, this is the inherent quality of the mind, whose task it is to distinguish one object from another, either by identifying it with terms and phrases, as in the case of most conceptions, or by merely making a distinction between objects, as in the case of perceptions. If we didn't have discrimination, I suppose that, if you think about early mankind, when there was a lot of danger. There were a lot of dangerous things out there, right? When early man was trying to survive, and if it weren't able to discern danger from safety, then there wouldn't be any ability to survive. So we can see that this is discernment is discrimination is a fundamental tool that we need all the time. We use it like when you see the difference between a red light and a green light when you're driving, right? So, all of these things, discrimination is playing a role all the time in terms of how we are differentiating one thing from another. He says, thus it is present in all forms of cognition, playing an essential role in abstract thought and imagination, as well as in the simplest visual and audio perception. And we can say even in the simplest of whatever type of perception, whether we're talking about through our eyes, ears, nose, even like in the summer when a mosquito lands on you, sometimes you can discriminate the sensation of a mosquito landing on you, right? And then you know that, oh, there's a mosquito. Then you can choose what to do with it. Hopefully you make the right choice. There's also a few things I want to share from Jeffrey Hopkins. Jeffrey Hopkins' Meditation on Emptiness, by the way, I haven't mentioned this previously. It does have a section, or maybe I did mention it previously, I don't remember, but it's got a section called The Selfless, where he goes into all phenomenology from a Prasangika point of view, consequence middle way school, and all the mental factors are described in here. And in some of it, the language is a little different than what we've seen, but it's some of the same concepts that we've seen. But I do like what he talks about in regard to discrimination. He says here, did I skip us? Yeah. In general, discrimination involves the differentiation of objects. As a mental factor accompanying a non-conceptual mind, such as an I consciousness, it implies a non-confusion of the details of the object without which a later identification could not be made. So once more, we see that discrimination allows one to differentiate at the moment, and then to, of course, through the force of our mindfulness and our ability to remember, to recall, to use that discrimination again, so we don't have to continually discriminate things we've already encountered, things that we have seen before. Yeah, Bob. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Yeah, Bob's question is, like if you use an object like an orange, and you would have the kind of initial visual or maybe even other perceptions of the orange, and then at some point be able to make that bridge over into the conceptualization of it, of this is an orange. Yeah, I mean, I think again, that's how we generally are dealing with most of what we come to know, is that we initially are knowing a lot of things through our sensory awarenesses, and then the bridge between that and what we experience in terminology, being able to relate to it through concepts, language, what have you, all of that. Obviously, there are some things in just the conceptual domain that one can come to understand without sensory reference, So again, that would be a whole nother level of just working at a conceptual level to discriminate between various ideas or thoughts, theories, what have you, things like that. But yeah, I think that would be correct to say. And again, this is something we can see certainly in regard to the way that we've come to classify phenomena in the Prasangika Madhyamaka in terms of the two truths, that you do have, a whole level of designation and ability to discriminate the various phenomena that exist, that is part of what we call conventional truth. And of course, then there's the way we discriminate their ultimate level of existence, which is in terms of emptiness. So again, it plays a pretty prominent role, and actually Jeffrey Hopkins is going to talk about this in the next slide. He says here, discrimination is the heart of identifying the object of negation in the view of selflessness, and then reflecting on a reasoning proving non-inherent existence. Thus, far from being a hindrance to the path, correct discrimination is to be enhanced. And so you can see that, again, discrimination at a very fundamental level plays a key role in terms of our ability to experience the world, to know what is what, to know this is that, and so on. But at a deeper level, it's a very important tool that we use our discrimination to finally, Finely, not finally, but finally look at things, and so that we can come to know the true nature of existence, so we can come to know emptiness. to understand the object of negation correctly, to be able to do all the appropriate reasoning and to come to that realization. So discrimination is, again, a very important part of our mental landscape, if you will, in terms of realizations. So let me take a look and see. I think I'm gonna go ahead and take it off the slides for a moment, unless there's any questions on the slides or anything I've shared up here. Let's go ahead and take that off for a moment. So let's do the stop share. Got to do that on this. You guys aren't seeing all of this because it's not on the TV screen here, but where's my cursor? My cursor, oh, there it is. Okay. This way we go back to being people getting to watch me instead of a blank screen or something. So at the very bottom of page 19, there's another bit here. Just as it has been, I went through this part, just as it has been said above, it is a knower that upon the aggregation of the three apprehends the uncommon sign of an object. Also, a discussion of the five aggregates, this is a text by Vasubandhu, says, what is discrimination? It apprehends the sign of an object. Now again, this term sign is being used in a very general way there. We actually are going to look at these two terms that were in the description further up above, where it said apprehending the sign and apprehending the mark. Sign and mark are, just two different terms that we're going to define slightly differently, though obviously they don't really in English have a whole lot of distinguishing characteristics. But when discrimination is divided, it says at the bottom of page 19, there are two: the apprehension of a sign and the apprehension of a mark. So let's go to the top of page 20 and take a look at these and come to kind of understand a little bit more about what's being meant by that terminology. The apprehension of a sign is an apprehension of an uncommon sign of an object which appears to a non-conceptual consciousness. So this is the sign that we would say is within the object, that non-conceptual consciousness, such as our eye consciousness, is registering, that causes one to, again, if we use color as the example, to distinguish yellow from red or from blue or green or orange or whatever the color might be. So we are going to call that a sign, and so we're talking about, again, that this factor of discrimination can be applied in both instances. When it is non-conceptual, that's when we call it the apprehension of a sign, so that we can, through our eyes, ears, what have you, we can discriminate things. And again, we finely tune our discrimination through memory and what have you to be able to recognize a lot of things through audio signals and things that we receive visually and what have you. So you'll know the sound when you pick up the phone or something and you hear, even if it's not showing on your phone who's calling, you will recognize the voice over time because you've heard that particular pattern. So again, that's what's going on in terms of discrimination in that domain. The apprehension of a mark is an apprehension of an uncommon sign of an object which appears to conceptual thought. So all those things that are the domain of conceptuality, which are, again, that way that we are able to work with phenomena in a bit of an indirect way because we're always working with that mental image, but nonetheless, we will still have things that can be discriminated so that when you're thinking about daytime, you're distinguishing it as different from nighttime, or when you're thinking about friend, you're distinguishing it as different from enemy or stranger or what have you. So we have ways of conceptualizing and knowing kind of a mark, if you will, an uncommon sign that will allow us to know that this is friend, this is enemy, this is stranger, what have you. The basis of engagement for these two types of discrimination are perceptions, hearing, differentiation, and knowledge. So we saw these also on the previous page in that response that was given as part of a Sangha's text. It said, apprehending the mark, etc., through which one designates an expression to objects of perceptions, hearing, differentiation, and knowledge. So let's go through each of these because we see that these are just ways of talking about all the objects that we're essentially getting at through our discrimination in either a conceptual or non-conceptual way. Of course, everything can be gotten at eventually through conceptuality to some domain. We can always know things in there, but obviously the things we can know at a non-conceptual level are going to be limited to the ways in which they're appearing to particular consciousnesses and so on. So the very first one are perceptions that involve designating an expression to objects manifestly perceived. So we are going to manifestly perceive something, going back again, for example, to the eye consciousness perceiving blue. Maybe it's a sky blue that we see. And so we then are able to, on the basis of that perception, we will designate an expression. We will impute a conception or give a term to that particular thing that's being discriminated. So we'll call it sky blue, and again, in different languages, you'll have different words for it, but this is the way of discriminating that particular phenomenon that we are going to know as different from navy blue or, sea blue or whatever. I mean, lots of different blues out there. When I worked at Levi Strauss, they would always come up with these really interesting names for the colors of the different seasons of the garments and everything. I always thought it was kind of funny, but anyway, merely labeled. Um, so this first one, perceptions, actually, Venerable George points out that the literal translation of the Tibetan is seeing. And so to some degree, I mean, we're not just talking about visual, but obviously we get a lot of information visually. But anything that we manifestly perceive, any objects of perception, we are able to designate an expression in reference to them. Hearing involves designating an expression in dependence on hearing credible words. So these are kind of, again, objects of thought, things that you've heard about. So if somebody tells you, oh, I was just in India, and you ask them, oh, what was India like? And they give you all of these words to describe what India is like. You're not having a direct perception of India, right? You're being given knowledge through your hearing of the words, the description of what India is like, and you are able to then discriminate a view of what India is like on the basis of those words. It's obviously very different than what you get from a perception, but nonetheless, it's still a valid discrimination when we are able to hear credible words that give a feeling for what that is that we're discriminating. Differentiation is the third one, or sometimes this is called distinguishing. Involves designating an expression to objects ascertained in dependence on signs. So this is taking it a little bit further in terms of highlighting in particular something that we have to rely upon on our spiritual path, which is reasoning. And again, this was pointed out by Jeffrey Hopkins earlier in terms of a key part of our discrimination is developing the correct discrimination of the object of negation and of being able to refute that through reasoning and so on. So here we have the ability to designate an expression through our discrimination in dependence upon the sort of signs or reasons, characteristics, things that were given. It's kind of interesting because they use signs here when sign was used earlier, and it's a very different meaning in this context. Sign is often the term that's given to a reason. So when you have traditional logic in Tibetan Buddhism, I don't think it's that different in Western reasoning. There's usually a thesis and then there's a reason. So if we said, for example, that the pot is impermanent because it is a conditioned phenomenon, because it's a caused phenomenon. So you would have the thesis is the subject, the pot. The predicate is impermanent. So that's your thesis. The pot is impermanent. And so someone could always ask, well, why? Why is the pot impermanent? And then you give them a reason, a sign. You give them something that backs it up so that they can then understand. And of course, the sign has to be something that they can validly discern, that they can use their discrimination to come to know. And if you use the idea that it is a conditioned phenomenon, it's a caused phenomenon. Therefore, it's impermanent, meaning it's changing moment by moment. And of course, if you've studied any philosophy, then you would have an ability to get that, to prove that predicate by virtue of that sign or that reason. So we are able to, use our discrimination in that regard to be able to distinguish or differentiate things in regard to things that we're ascertaining through logic, through reasoning, through apprehending things in that way, through using that process. Now, the fourth one, it was interesting. None of the teachers that I have the commentaries of actually explained this one, but I'm assuming that they didn't explain it because it would mean, it seems to be going in a bit of a hierarchy. We start off with just what we're getting through our perceptions, which is mostly our senses. Then we're getting into what we're knowing through some process of thought that we're, by hearing the words of others, and then we're getting into the actual reasoning. It would seem that this one, what's called knowledge, involves designating an expression to objects ascertained directly. And I would think this would mean when we are actually ascertaining things directly through our meditative concentration, through our ability to have some of the conceptual overlay fall away, and we know emptiness, for example, directly, or we know impermanence, subtle impermanence directly. But I'm just guessing at that because none of the other teachers explained that. So, but it does seem to be in a bit of a hierarchical kind of presentation. And so, and it makes sense that that is real knowledge. I mean, what we are wanting to differentiate in terms of our, at the deepest level, is the knowledge of what is true, the knowledge of what is correct. And so we can then give designation to that, designate an expression or impute a conception to what we mean by emptiness on the basis of that realization, on the basis of attaining that. But that's, again, something that would involve a lot more processes and to get there. So again, this could be used in terms of really showing how our discrimination does become finer and does become capable of doing more powerful things as we are able to utilize it. As I mentioned earlier, just having discrimination to be able to tell when a light's green versus red or whatever, this is important, but we want to obviously use our discrimination at a much finer level to be able to know the truth of reality. Let me go on and do a bit more. The next part is quoting from the Treasury of Knowledge, which is, again, Vasubandhu's text. It explains discrimination as being twofold: the apprehension of a sign with regard to an object, and the apprehension of a sign with regard to a convention, which is here not convention in terms of conventional truths and things, but rather a term that arises in the mind. This is at least according to Venerable George. So let's look at the explanation that's given there for each of these. They seem to be somewhat similar to the way we talked about discrimination earlier in terms of signs versus marks, but again, it's just a slightly different presentation because it's from a different text. I think that presentation that we looked at earlier was from Asanga's, whereas, well, actually, that was from a discussion of the five aggregates. This is from Treasury of Knowledge. But anyway, let's look at the description of each of these. It says the apprehension of a sign with regard to an object means to apprehend it through individually distinguishing the object's particularities, such as blue, yellow, and so forth. So once more, this seems to be something that's very much involved in our direct perception of things, primarily sensory, but it's not maybe necessarily sensory. The apprehension of a sign with regard to a convention means to apprehend it through individually distinguishing the convention's particularities, as when one thinks, this is a man, that is a woman. So this is much more, again, involved in thought and terminology that we are distinguishing so that we can then say, this is this, that is that, and make those kinds of things accurately, statements accurately. And lots of ways of parsing up discrimination, but I don't know that they lead to a whole lot more knowledge necessarily, but just to appreciate the ways that our discrimination does play a role. The next one, again, this will, let me go ahead and put the slides on again. Do the share screen. And then let's go to from the current slide. Okay, that should be on for folks now. So this is from Geshe Rabten again, and the very first part of this is where we're looking at the presentation that we're going to see in the text, these different ways that we can talk about discrimination in terms of where it is arising from. So according to their bases, there are 6 forms of discernment or discrimination, ranging from those associated with visual contact up to discernment associated with mental contact. Also, 6 types of discernments are classified according to the reference. This is the next thing we're going to look at. Let's just take a look then, keeping the screen up there. We'll just look at on page 20 at the bottom where each of these is set out. Again, I'm not going to read all of these. I'll read the first one. Here it says, further, when discrimination is differentiated in terms of its support, there it was called bases, there are 6. The very first one, discrimination arising from contact upon the aggregation of a visible form, an eye sense power, and an eye consciousness. So again, when those 3 aggregate, come together. And we're going to talk about the mental factor of contact, that is the moment of mind that is present with that aggregation, that is, receiving that aggregation in a sense. Then you have a discrimination that can be arising on the basis of that. And then when you have the ear sense power, the sound that the ear is hearing, and the ear consciousness, then you have another discrimination, and so on. And that goes all the way through the final one, which is the aggregation of a phenomenon. Once more, phenomenon, because the mental consciousness can know all phenomena. Eventually, the mind of a Buddha, which is a full development of mental consciousness, can understand and know all phenomena. But this is said to be the domain of the mental consciousness, is everything that exists, all phenomena. So any particular phenomenon, a mental sense power, which once more is the previous moment of consciousness, and then a mental consciousness present in that moment itself. When those aggregate, then we can have a discrimination arising from that contact. Again, it's just another way of looking at discrimination, that we can talk about it in regard to that. A more interesting presentation, perhaps, is this last little bit, and we'll go through this, and then I'll see if there's questions again. How are we doing time-wise? I think we're fine. Good. So, as was said in that previous slide, this is Geshe Rapton calls this 6 types of discernments are classified according to their reference. So, in our text, it's in terms of object of observation. So let's go through each of these, and when we go through the one that's on the slide, then I'll go to the text right after and we'll read what's in our text. But I like Geshe Rapton's in a little more colloquial language versus some of what we have is a bit technical. But the first one is called by Stephen Batchelor discernment with a sign. In our text, it's called reasoned discrimination. This kind of discernment or discrimination is of 3 types. That which is skilled in relating to their corresponding objects, that which discerns concrete impermanent phenomena, and I might add there as such, meaning that it actually is able to know them as impermanent phenomena, for example, and that which has a clear, distinct referent, meaning that the mind is clear enough for it to be able to get at its object, for it to have that discrimination. So the very first one, skilled in relating to their corresponding objects, in our text it's called discrimination skilled in the relationship between names and objects. So this is something we acquire over time, right? When you're born, fresh out of the womb, you don't have real good discrimination in that regard. You can't discriminate. If you had a baby there and you said, would you like the rattle or the bottle? I mean, and they're like looking at these things, and maybe they can discern something about them on the basis of just their own awareness of them through their senses, but they don't have any ability to distinguish the names of them, right? So if you didn't show them and you said, do you want the bottle? Do you want the bottle? But the baby doesn't know what bottle is because they haven't learned the name for that particular object that it refers to. They're not skilled in that. They don't have that ability. Whereas those of us who've been in the world for a while, number of decades, we've got an ability to discern things correctly in regard to the terminology and the corresponding objects, to know what everything is referring to. So you can go into a hardware store and not just try to, make something up. You can actually say, I would like to buy this, and I need that, and whatever the case might be. Obviously, we wouldn't have the ability for all of that, but it's something that in the world at large, we would definitely see that that's something we accumulate over time, where we become skilled in that relationship between the names or the objects, the terms that we give to the objects, and then the objects that are the reference of that. The second one that is on here, as I mentioned, it discerns concrete and permanent phenomena, as I kind of alluded to. It really is seeing them in that way as being impermanent. So if we look at what's in our text on page 21, it says discrimination observing the compounded as impermanent, and so on. So this is a little bit finer discrimination, that we do have to develop over time to come to understand things, even in a deeper awareness of how they exist conventionally. The Buddha says that one of our fundamental misconceptions that we have is that we think things that are compounded or conditioned are unchanging, and we don't, we adhere to them as if they are, and yet the reality is everything is constantly changing. Our bodies, the world around us, everything in a constant state of flux. So this is, again, a slightly different level discrimination. It's kind of interesting that it's called Discernment with a Sign by Geshe Rabtin or Stephen Batchelor, which is the literal translation of it. Reasoned discrimination means that, again, you do have to engage in some process to get there, to kind of have that understanding. Even with regard to the first one, to be able to know what terminology refers to the corresponding objects and so on. The third one, which has a clear, distinct referent, I would say most of the awarenesses we have, unless we're somewhere somewhat impaired in terms of our awareness, are going to have that ability to discern things correctly, to have clear discrimination. In our text, it was simply called discrimination having a clear object of observation and subjective aspect. So to get a better feeling for what these three are signifying, we'll look at the next one, which is the exact opposite of it, which is discernment without a sign or unreasoned discrimination. So let's take a look at that. This is also of three types, being the opposite of the three mentioned above. The first is the discernment of a young child who, having not yet learnt a language, does not identify objects with signs, that is, names and terms. So as I was mentioning earlier, you wouldn't have the ability to do that. And it's not to say that a young child or an infant doesn't have conceptuality. They just don't have the terminology that can refer to the objects that are in their conceptual awareness. I think their conceptuality is kind of probably a very, I mean, obviously we don't know. I can't ask an infant to describe what's going on in their mind when they're thinking about mother's milk, for example. But obviously there's some referent to that they are thinking of that is causing them to be distressed at the time when they're hungry and to be feeling satisfied at the time when they receive the mother's milk and so on. But that's the first one. The second is the discernment of a meditative perception of ultimate truth in which there is no sign of any conditioned phenomenon. So this is kind of interesting, is that in this case, it's a very highly developed state of mind that is the opposite of the other. Whereas the first one is where we are using our reasoning and being able to know the impermanence of a phenomenon or know even the emptiness of a phenomenon in a conceptual way. This second example is the discernment where we have a meditative perception of ultimate truth, meaning emptiness, in which there's no sign of any conditioned phenomenon, meaning that this would be a direct perception. So it's actually a very fine discrimination. I forgot to read these on our the first two. Then on our text, page 21. Unreasoned discrimination is also threefold. Again, opposite. The very first one, discrimination unskilled in the relationship between names and objects. We went through that. Discrimination observing the compounded as permanent and so on. This is where there is a difference in this. It's kind of interesting that that one is, I can't explain why Geshe Rabtin uses that example of something that is actually a high realization, at least from what I can tell. But the opposite that's given in our text is where somebody is having the incorrect perception or conception, where they are actually looking at something that is impermanent and perceiving of it as permanent. Yeah, Bob. I think so. I think so. And he's trying to point out that I guess, we can say that this is a direct opposite, but as Bob is pointing out, maybe Geshe Rabtin's text is going beyond, what is presented in this text to show that there can even be these extraordinary examples of what we would say is discernment without a sign, meaning it's without reasoning, So it does make some sense in that regard, and kind of pointing out that that particular wisdom that we are generating in the discernment of this meditative perception of ultimate truth. Because discernment, once more, or discrimination as we've been calling it, is an omnipresent mental factor. So even when that meditator is sitting in meditative equipoise, realizing emptiness, discrimination is going to be present. But it's going to be a very different discrimination than the discrimination we have present in our conventional mind of conceptuality that's always dealing with mental images and not knowing things in a direct way. So this one is an interesting one to point out the difference between those two. The third is the discernment of the formless absorption at the peak of samsara, in which there is no sign of a clear or distinct referent. Last week I mentioned that fourth formless absorption, again we have the four concentrations and the four formless absorptions. The fourth one we call the peak of cyclic existence, but the real name, I mentioned this last week, is without discrimination, not without discrimination. So it's said to be that you're almost as if you don't have any discrimination, because what is there is so subtle that the subtle discrimination that you have isn't really capable of discerning much. And so that's why, again, that I mentioned these four formless absorptions are not really ideal supports for meditation on emptiness, because you need strong discernment and discrimination to get to that. So we can see that this example that's being used of this peak of samsara, peak of psychic existence, this without discrimination, not without discrimination, where there's this very subtle discrimination present, but nothing that allows you to really get a clear referent or distinct referent. So these are examples of these, this second one. Well, let me go continue. I think I'll go just plow right through. Hold on to your questions if you do have any, and we'll have some time at the end. The third one is called Discernment of the Limited by Geshe Rabten. Discrimination of the Small is what's in our text. So Geshe Rabten says, this is a discernment present in beings abiding in the desire realm who have not attained even the preparatory stage for mental absorption. It is said to be of something limited, since it discerns a world in which life is shorter, afflictions are more numerous, endowments and even the environment are of a lower quality than in higher states of existence. So the ones we're going to be going through here, the remaining ones, 3, 4, 5, 6, are kind of progressively going through some of these different realms, starting with the desire realm. So in essence, this third one, what we're calling discrimination of the small, is equivalent to any of our desire realm discernment, desire realm discrimination, which is called the small or the limited because of all these factors that were mentioned in here. This is a world where in general life is shorter, afflictions are more numerous, endowments and even the environment are of a lower quality. As I mentioned, when you get to the form realm, which is what the fourth one is going to be about, you have a much subtler body and a subtler environment that you're abiding in, and you're free of some of the coarser ways that we suffer in terms of mental unhappiness. Physical embodiment is very different, all of that, the environment. So this is kind of related to the minds of the desire realm. So if we go to number 3 on our sheet, page 21, it says discrimination of the small refers to A, discriminations in the continuum of an ordinary being of the desire realm who has not obtained an actual concentration, because if they've attained an actual concentration, then they have begun to refine their consciousness to that degree, but they're still caught up in all those objects of the desire realm. And then B would be discrimination that's observing the attributes of the desire realm. So again, any of the times that we are looking at anything in regard to the desire realm, we're going to have that type of a discrimination present. This third one, which again is discrimination of the small. The fourth one, discernment of the vast, discrimination of the vast is what we called it in our text. This is a discernment existing within the realm of form. Again, form realm is what it's usually called. Desire realm, formless realm, these three levels of existence. It is of the vast in the sense that it discerns a world in which afflictions are fewer and wholesome qualities are greater than in the realm of desire, the desire realm. Let's look at our text. Our text actually divides it into two, similar to what the previous one was. Discrimination of the vast refers to A, discrimination observing the form realm, and B, discriminations in the continua of form realm beings. So the differentiation, at least for those two, we can see in that, okay, let's say Nancy is, really advancing in her meditation, and she's gone to calm abiding, and then she's eventually generated the first concentration, the first of these 4 concentrations. Once she attains that state, she'll come back off of her cushion, and as I mentioned, she'll engage with all these objects of the desire realm, but she'll have the discernment that is observing the form realm when she is in the meditation, and then potentially she will have the mind that's an actual mind of the form realm in terms of having a body in the form realm if she takes rebirth there after this existence, anytime after this existence. So while she's off the cushion, she might be in the desire realm and seeing that, but when she's on the cushion, she's having a discernment of the form realm, and all the qualities that are associated with the form realm will be appearing to her because she has diminished, all of the attachment to the desire realm, and so on. So if she does that again and continues creating that type of karma, what again we call this unmoving or immovable karma, if you create all of that karma around the first concentration, at the end of her life, she could then be reborn in that existence, the first concentration realm of the form realm. And then we could call that the discriminations in the continua of form realm beings. Because at that point, she won't just be somebody who has a form realm mind, she'll actually be a form realm being. And it's the same for, well, actually, no, it's not true. That's for the other ones. But I mean, you could say that for any of these four concentrations. You could certainly, I suppose, at some level say it with regard to the absorptions. But that's not how the other ones are presented. Because what happens when you go from the four concentrations to the four absorptions, maybe I'll even read a little bit of meditative states, is that you start doing these very different types of thought processes, because you start moving away from just this idea of coarseness and peaceness to even seeing everything as infinite space. That's the first one. And then you see infinite space in kind of something you want to abandon, and you see everything as infinite consciousness. And then you get rid of infinite consciousness by replacing it with nothingness. And then you get rid of nothingness with replacing it with this very fine discrimination. Again, this being without discrimination, but yet not without discrimination completely. And so you just kind of move into these very subtler states. Again, that's the way it's described. So what we're going to look at in terms of the next two are the first two of those formless absorptions, infinite space and infinite consciousness. That'll be number 5. And then the nothingness will be number 6. Okay, so let's go on the slide first to what Geshe Rabten says. He calls this discernment of infinity, because we talk about these as infinite space and infinite consciousness. Our text calls it discrimination of the limitless. This discernment exists in the formless realms, where one is absorbed in the infinity of space and the infinity of consciousness. It is so called because it discerns space and consciousness to be infinite. So let me describe a little bit of these from meditative states. You might find this kind of interesting. So limitless space, he says, like the concentrations, the formless absorption of limitless space has the 7 preparations. Again, I haven't talked about all of those, but there are these ways that you go through to develop that state, separating from the 4th concentration and moving towards this first formless absorption of limitless space. He says, let me move forward. It says here, the mental contemplation of individual knowledge of the character, which is one of the preparations, views the 4th concentration as gross and the discrimination that space is limitless as peaceful. Nevertheless, though the meditator is analyzing, he or she now engages mainly in stabilizing meditation by means of calm abiding. Through viewing the 4th concentration as gross, and through repeatedly taking to mind the thought, space is limitless, space is limitless, the meditator gradually develops the meditative absorption of limitless space, and within focusing on the discrimination that space is limitless, generates the 9 uninterrupted paths and the 9 paths of release, which is another whole thing. But nonetheless, it was interesting that discrimination is mentioned in here, that by keeping one's mind discriminating the infinity of space, the limitless space. And then one would go on to do the same thing with regard to infinite consciousness, that consciousness is infinite, pervading everywhere, and so on. One does the same type of process for, he says here, to attain the meditative absorption of limitless consciousness, someone who has attained the discrimination of limitless space begins to view that discrimination as gross, and to view the discrimination that consciousness is limitless as peaceful. At the beginning, in dependence upon calm abiding, the person engages in some analysis, but mainly in stabilizing meditation. There are 7 preparations as before, and the meditator must overcome these 9 cycles of afflictions pertaining to limitless space. So there are 9 of these, various paths of release that one goes through. So again, this is just, it's kind of maybe beyond what we're talking about here, but it's to get the idea that you're still using your discrimination at that level, and that's why it's being talked about as one of these 6, because you're needing to make a discrimination of that infinite quality, whether it be space or consciousness, as being more peaceful, and then you supplant that, getting rid of what was beneath it, which in the case of the first one is the 4th concentration. In the case of the second one is limitless space itself. Yeah, Bob. Yeah, yeah. Because it becomes infinite. Bob was pointing out how you kind of are forming discriminations that there's not much left to discriminate. And of course, the next one, nothingness, where you're discriminating nothingness, he describes this: to attain the meditative absorption of nothingness, the person who has attained the meditative absorption of limitless consciousness begins to view the discrimination that consciousness is limitless as gross, and to view as peaceful the discrimination that there is nothing formed or formless to be apprehended. So kind of really spacing out at some level. I don't know. So let's go ahead and take a look back on number 5, what we had in our text. Discrimination of the limitless refers to discriminations observing the source of infinite space and the source of infinite consciousness. So again, source, I think, is just referring to the sphere of that, the domain of that you're focused on, that infinite space, and then you go to infinite consciousness. The final one, number 6, is related to nothingness, the discernment of nothing at all. Discrimination of nothingness is what we call it in our text. This discernment, Geshe Rabten says, is that of the formless realm, in which the mind is absorbed in nothingness. It is so called since it considers that there is nothing at all presenting itself to the mind. Again, you can still say you're discriminating or discerning that nothingness, but what is appearing to the mind is nothingness. So it's very subtle. Like I said, you're getting to these really strange states of mind, I would think. In our text, it simply says discrimination of nothingness refers to discriminations observing the source of nothingness, the sphere of nothingness. Now, again, why this is it? This is where it ends. We still have one more level, right? With discrimination, without discrimination, but not without discrimination. This very, very subtle state. It's called the peak of cyclic existence, the peak of samsara. But it's not included because of the subtlety of discrimination that's there, that it's gotten to that level where we're not even going to call it one of these discernments or discriminations because it's just way too peaceful, way too removed from everything. Maybe I'll mention a little bit about that, what's talked about in here in regard to moving to the peak of cyclic existence. This text, Meditative State, says, by the way, these are on I started on page 113 and now I'm on 115. To attain the meditative absorption of the peak of cyclic existence, the person who has attained the meditative absorption of nothingness begins to view as gross the discrimination that there is nothing formed or formless to be apprehended. The meditator then begins to think, coarse discrimination does not exist. Subtle discrimination is not non-existent. Coarse discrimination does not exist means that the gross or coarse discrimination called nothingness, which the meditator is now viewing, does not exist. In other words, the meditator lets it go, and subtle discrimination is left. All that one is left with is just the subtlest bit of discrimination. So, again, and just as a side note, I've heard from many teachers that when this was all taught, of course, in the Hindu tradition, that many people mistook these very, very subtle states that you can attain at that level as being moksha, as being liberation from all of what plagued them and so on. But you haven't attained it yet. According to the Buddhist view, you've gone through a mundane path of separating from that to some degree, suppressing all of that attachment by developing these very subtle states. But all of it's still there. It's just not manifest. And it will all resurface when the causes and conditions are there for it to resurface. When you descend back down, if you're reborn in such a realm of the peak of psychic existence, well, then you don't hang out there forever. You hang out there for as long as that unmoving karma got you there. And then you fall from that. And then you would fall, continually until you're back in an embodied state, dealing with the same old stuff that you tried to separate from by doing all of that work. That kind of concludes discrimination. Let me add one more slide from Geshe Rabten. This is not in our text, but I just thought it would be interesting to share. In addition, he says we can talk of deceived and non-deceived discernments or discriminations. So again, just pointing out that he doesn't explain them any further, but obviously we do have deception involved in a lot of what we're discriminating. If we look at the teachings on emptiness, obviously a lot of what we're discriminating as existing from its own side that even does appear to our sense consciousness, as they say. There is an appearance of things existing on their own inherently to our sense consciousness as well as our mental consciousness. So we have those to which we are deceived in regard to the appearance being different from how it actually exists. And then we have non-deceived discernments, which at the deepest level would be our realization of emptiness. So let's stop the share there, and I think we're back. Let me actually have to stop this here. That's, I think, one thing I have to do before. Okay, now I think it's okay with everybody there. All right, so let's see what questions come up for people. It's about 8:08, and I can certainly go on to the next mental factor of intention, but that was a lot of information. So, yeah, Nan. Nan's question is it fair to assume that the people like Geshe Rapton who've written about these things have experienced all these different discriminations, discernments, or what have you? I don't know. I mean, I I certainly would hope so. I, I think that if we were all working with stuff that's hearsay from centuries and centuries and no one ever experiencing it, it would probably be not doing the trick. I mean, obviously, the goal, of course, for all of us as we go through this, and that's why I suppose once more, why are we presented with all these different categories of discernment? So we can be encouraged to explore, well, what is it going to be like to have those particular discernments, to be able to differentiate phenomena in a very different way because of the subtlety of the mind, and so on. Uh, okay. Hmm. Right. So Nan's question is, or comment, I guess, I don't know if it's a question, comment, is that Geshe Rabtin's not approaching it though from the point of view of the instruction that would be necessary to give to a meditator to be able to accomplish that. And that's true because the instruction abides elsewhere. I mean, it is in other texts. You know, this the text that I mentioned, Meditative States, goes into a great description of how one goes about that process of these preparations for each of the concentrations and so on. And then all of the steps to get calm abiding, which precedes that, are all set out in the Lam Rim text and so on. So absolutely, this isn't a how-to manual. This is a description of these various factors that can exist at different levels of subtlety and experience based on how we develop our minds. So once more, I mean, this just reiterates what I said, I think, way back in the first class, is that you could say there are many, many other factors to the mind, I'm sure, beyond these 51. But why these 51 are chosen is because they are really useful tools to help us to practice, to know what we have to do in order to fine tune our minds, in order to be aware of what's all happening, so we can be more engaged in reality in the way it truly exists, as opposed, or actually exists, as opposed to the way that we think it exists. So I don't know. That helps. I've got a question on the screen from Rachel. Rachel says these four are related to the two types of sign and mark, but I'm only seeing that the first relates to the sign. How else? The four that you're talking about, Rachel, are the four that we had on page 20, I assume, right? No, maybe not 20. Yeah, they're there. Perceptions, hearing, differentiation, and knowledge. So let me look at your question again. These four are related to the two types of sign and mark, but I am only seeing that the first relates to the sign. How else? I'm not sure I can answer that question. So what she's saying is, I think, when we look at those four that are on page 20 towards the top, perceptions, hearing, differentiation, and knowledge, is that it's really the first one that seems to be more related to sign, right? Yeah, Bob. Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah, right. And so So Bob's just pointing out what I think you're seeing, Rachel, which is that really just the first one is related to sign, or can be, certainly including sign, whereas all the others seem to be marks because we're dealing with the conceptual mind. And nonetheless, these seem to be, the basis for engaging in these two types of discrimination are these four. So maybe it's not meant to be that they go across the board for both of them, but that we could say these are the basis for both of them, and one of them is only present in the first, whereas the other can be present in the remaining. I don't know. That's my speculation on that. Tony says, why is the vastness of consciousness considered separate or apart or not integral with the vastness of space? I guess, again, the reason why these two are set out in that order is that there's a subtler degree when one's looking at space versus consciousness. I guess that consciousness is a subtler phenomenon than space. And they are two different phenomena. We can say consciousness can pervade all of space, and I suppose space can pervade consciousness, but consciousness is a very different phenomenon and is a subtler phenomenon because of the nature of it. In space, we can, again, we're not talking about just visible space. We're talking about space in a sense of absence of obstruction, just that every space is everywhere. Space is limitless and pervading everywhere. But I think it's still a coarser phenomenon. That's just my thinking on it. Um, uh, yeah, and Rachel's just saying, yeah, space is the lack of material obstruction. This is how we generally talk about space. Space being an absence, a negation. It's a very strange way to talk about it. Normally, we like to think, like if you went to some place, you want to say, well, how much space is there? How much space is there in my car? So I know how much stuff I can take. But essentially, we're talking about everywhere that anything exists, there is even space, because the space is really more of a conceptual way of looking at things. That in order for my hand to be here, for example, there has to be an absence of obstructive contact, or my hand couldn't exist in that space that we think of as a physical space, but essentially it's much more of a mental phenomenon that we're getting at. Anyway, I don't know. This gets to be a little bit uh, spacey. Tony says, yes, like space is non-obstruction, like clear mind is non-obstructed. Yeah, I mean, I suppose we can say that there is that element of non-obstruction with both of it, though currently our minds are obstructed to knowing, certain things, but nonetheless, we would say consciousness can pervade all of space. But I don't know. This is, again, I can't answer these questions fully. These are the traditional way that it's set out, is that is starting with infinite space, a coarser way of looking at things versus infinite consciousness. And my guess is, again, that it has to do with just the subtlety of that phenomenon, that consciousness is a much subtler phenomenon. Any other questions? Yeah, Rick. Yeah, Rick's question is, are we giving a special sense or definition to space as opposed to space-time continuity? I think to some degree we are, because we're not talking about, they're both wrapped up in the same thing to some degree, but we're essentially, usually when we talk about space, we're talking about it meaning a negation, an absence of obstructive contact, as opposed to the way I think that people who talk about space-time continuum, what have you, think about it as physical space, think about it as something that is sort of the referent of that to some degree, but we're getting at space through a negation by thinking about it in this way. That space is essentially an absence of obstruction, an absence of obstructive contact. And frankly, I find space one of the hardest topics to talk about, because it is very elusive in terms of getting at what we really mean by it. And of course, time can become equally elusive. But nonetheless, there's much more of a feeling of measuring or defining, delineating space and time that I see from that perspective, whereas that's not a part of the equation here. We're simply talking about space as this negation, as this There's no obstructive contact, therefore things can exist in physical space. But it's because of what we call space, which is the absence of that. Um, um, Rachel's got one note here, and I'm not sure how to apply it, but maybe she can give me a little more to work with. She says the other thing is the dissolution process in death, dissolving the four elements. Um, but I'm not sure where that fits in. Rachel, I'm sorry. Maybe I'm getting tired. um, anyway, yeah, Nan. Mm, right, right. Again, that's in the what Nan's saying is about when I was talking about unmoving karma, which is when one has attained a first concentration and created the karma to be reborn in the form realm in the first concentration, that is the karma that could potentially ripen to take you there because you haven't done anything deeper with that first concentration mind. You haven't realized emptiness. You haven't made it into a super mundane path. So in essence, it kind of goes, it propels you in an unmoving way, meaning that you won't go from the first having created the first concentration to be reborn in the second concentration, or to be reborn in the formless absorption. It's on a direct level. It's unmoving. It's unwavering. It's not going back into the desire realm because you've created that powerful karma. That's a virtuous karma. It's a very powerful mind of suppressing those coarser delusions and maintaining some subtlety of mind that's in line with that. So then you take rebirth in the form realm in the first concentration, and you continue to have a subtler form in that existence, experiencing all the things that happen in that first concentration, and you eventually part from that when the karma wears out, because that unmoving karma isn't going to cycle forever. It's going to propel you there for whatever duration of. Well, no, but my point about doing something with it was that you do something with it now in the human realm when you develop the mind of the first concentration, which is not use it as a mundane path simply to experience the peace of that level, but to use it as a super mundane path, make it a support for your realization of emptiness. Okay. Rachel added a few things. Uh, don't need to go into it more. This is in Kala Chakra after the four next dissolve consciousness, then space. Um, anyway, I'm going to let it go at that. And I'm no Kala Chakra expert at all. So, it's not my practice. But anyway, now Kala Chakra has a whole thing around space time too, that you get into a lot of other dimensions with a lot of this stuff that are in the tantric domain. Maybe we just set that aside. Acknowledge that that's again beyond the scope of the course and also beyond my knowledge, that's for sure. If any of you want to do a presentation on that. And Tony says thank you. um, I love you guys, see you in a couple weeks. So, okay. They say bye, Tony. Anyway, so let's go ahead and close for tonight. If you do have any further questions, once more, you can email them to me. I think most people have my email. And then I'll be happy to address those at the beginning of the next class. um, so let's go to page 235 of the prayer book, and we'll recite the two prayers that are there, the first two, as usual. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Then we'll do two prayers for our teachers, for His Holiness and Lama Zopa on page 244. As we recite these, we can think about all of our other teachers that we and others have a karmic connection with, so that we and others will never be parted from perfect guides in all our lives. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Chenrezig, Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. you who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. So we'll make some additional dedications at the end tonight. First of all, for those who were affected by the tragedy in Florida at the school there, those who were killed, wounded, even the killer himself, and all the family, friends, others in the community who were impacted by that, kind of sending some of this positive energy to those beings so that they can be healed in the midst of all of their suffering, can find true peace eventually, can have all the conditions that they need for that and to achieve greater peace. And also we make strong prayers for John Craig, a member of our community who is in the process of dying at this time, as well as his wife Susan, their family, all the other beings, people involved in caring for them. That whole process may unfold very peacefully so that John may have a peaceful passing into his next rebirth and find there everything that he needs to attain complete enlightenment as quickly as possible. And that all of those who are losing John in their lives will have some solace during this time. And then finally, we can dedicate for anyone else that we're holding in our hearts, whether there are beings who are experiencing obstacles or illness, are dying or have died. May they receive benefit from what we have done here tonight, find true peace and happiness. And may all beings have happiness through what we've done here this evening. Thank you all very much. Enjoyed this. And again, do let me know if there's any further questions. And thank you all who are online. Really appreciate you being there. Okay.